Welcome to Dr. America. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. Thanks for joining us today. Today's show, we're going to cover measles, which is a pretty dumb way to die in America, and concussions, because it's Super Bowl Sunday, and let's learn a little bit about how to protect the athletes in our lives. But before we jump into all that, I want to give you guys a little bit of an update about what is happening with Ebola. This was a story that we covered in our very, very first episode of Dr. America. And there is some good news to report, and there's still some work to be done. And I just kind of want to give you guys a little status update about where things are at with Ebola in West Africa. So far, there have been 21,000 cases of Ebola in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, with 8,000 deaths. In that grim picture, there has been a little bit of good news developing very recently. 2015 is off to a good start in West Africa because every 10 to 14 days, the WHO, the World Health Organization, they're telling us that the number of new cases diagnosed has been half the number diagnosed in the previous time period. So that kind of means that, like, roughly every 10 days, fewer and fewer and fewer of people living in West Africa are being diagnosed with Ebola, and that's really good news. And I'm deeply grateful to the Ebola fighters for all their hard work in restoring health and to the communities of West Africa. And it's really their hard work that has stopped this disease from infecting millions of people, which was where the WHO said we were going to be in January 2015 if we didn't get our act together. Thank you so much to all those Ebola fighters. We really appreciate your hard work. And I do respect that they are telling us that there is still some pretty important hard work that's left, and that we need to kind of keep up our vigilance and not fall into complacence. The director of operations for MSF, that's Médecins Sans Frontières, has summed up the current situation, saying that, quote, "The decline in the number of new cases is an opportunity to focus efforts on addressing the serious weaknesses that remain in the response. We are on the right track, but reaching zero cases will be difficult unless significant improvements are made in alerting new cases and tracing those who have been in contact with them." It sounds like they've got a lot of hard work still left, especially for the more rural, tough-to-reach parts of Sierra Leone, Liberia, and New Guinea. And we really, really commend those hard-working Ebola fighters for helping our brothers and sisters in West Africa. So, it's actually pretty fitting that we start today's episode with that update, because right now we are looking at an outbreak that is even more contagious than Ebola right here in America, and that is measles. Here is what we know so far about the measles outbreak that started in Disneyland, California. Okay, so the week before this past Christmas, the week before Christmas 2014, visitors to Disneyland started coming down with the symptoms of measles. And just to kind of give you guys a perspective on what that is, it's 4 days of high fevers and the 3 C's. And this is something that we're taught in medical school about measles. And even though very few of us are going to see this disease in our career, the 3 C's are cough, conjunctivitis, and coryza. Coryza is this fancy word that we use in med school. It really applies to a bad head cold, like a really bad head cold, sore throat, runny nose, that kind of stuff. So 4 days of high fevers, and then you got these 3 C's. And people started coming down with all these symptoms after going to Disneyland. And now this outbreak has spread to 85 people in 7 states. And it's because this virus, spreads quickly among people who have not been vaccinated. And those 7 states are California, which has the bulk of the outbreak, Oregon, Washington State, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Nebraska. So it's reaching pretty far. And to help us learn more about this outbreak, we're going to be talking with Dr. Jonathan Auth, to give us an update from Orange County, California, and to teach us what we need to know about the outbreak and what we need to do to stop the measles. So, just to give you guys a little bit of background about Dr. Auth. Okay, Dr. Jonathan Auth was born the second of 8 children in Twin Falls, Idaho. He received a Bachelor's of Art in Biology from Yale University, after which he worked for the NIH, that's the National Institutes of Health, in the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. He went on to receive his medical degree from the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California in 2004, and then completed his pediatric residency training at UCLA. And that's actually just, side note and full disclosure, Jonathan's a really good friend of mine from residency. We did our residency training together at UCLA. He's been a really good friend along with his wife, Melissa, and the two of them are both pediatricians. He's a general pediatrician and she's a pediatric neurologist. They both live and work in southern Orange County, where very close to where the measles outbreak started. And he's a practicing general pediatrician. He's, the parents of, they both him and Melissa are the parents of 2 beautiful kids, Emma, age 4, and Ethan, age 18 months. So we're really pleased to have Jonathan on the program. And Jonathan, thanks for being on the show.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
I know it's early out there, man. Thanks a lot for joining us. Really appreciate it.
No, it's no problem.
All right. So I know that you and Melissa are in Orange County, California. It's home of Disneyland and the starting point of this measles outbreak. And, you guys are both pediatricians, parents, big fans of that theme park. What has this outbreak meant to you? Like, what are you seeing in clinic and what are you seeing in your community?
Yeah, well, we're certainly seeing a lot of fear. A lot of questions are coming into the office. Families, for the most part, who are vaccinated and who are asking, how is this going to affect their decisions to go out into the community, and not just to Disneyland. Certainly that's a common destination for our families, but, even going to the mall, I think there's a lot of fear out there, and it's in people who are vaccinated. They're vaccinated already one time, and, they're asking, do I need to limit my contact? Do I need to get that second vaccine sooner? It's definitely on people's minds.
Yeah. So why don't we take a step back and talk about the measles virus? Hopefully, getting to understand this disease will help a little bit because, I don't want to, scare people and send us into that panic we saw with Ebola. But there are some important things that we need to know about this virus. And from what we do know, measles is not as deadly as Ebola, but it's much more contagious, right?
Yeah, the problem with measles is that something like 90% of people who are not protected, not immune to the disease, if they come into close contact with a infected individual, 90% contagion rate. So 90% of those people will end up getting sick from the disease. And it's an airborne disease, so it lingers sometimes in the environment for maybe even a couple of hours after the infected individual has left. So you don't need that high level of direct contact in order to become infected.
Right. So that actually makes it a big difference from Ebola, where you have to have actually had some contact with like infected bodily fluids and actually be in very, very close proximity to the person, because Ebola is not airborne, but, measles is.
Correct.
Okay. And, but what makes measles, because it's not as deadly as Ebola, but what makes it a big deal? Like, what are the consequences of getting infected?
Well, historically, mortality rates from measles, in the era prior to modern medicine were extremely high. It was a leading cause of death and a reason, back in the early part of the 20th century where people were very fearful of their lives for this. I mean, by some estimates, as many as 20% of people infected with measles may succumb to the illness eventually. In today's modern era, where we've got better access to medical care, interventions have certainly lessened the mortality rate, but still complications are high. Something like 10% of people who contract the measles disease will have a complication, and it can be something as benign as an ear infection or pneumonia. Something like 10% of people who get measles disease will end up having pneumonia and end up needing to be hospitalized frequently as a result of that. Brain injury actually is a significant problem. Swelling of the brain can occur after measles, and that can occur even years later. It's not necessarily an acute complication, but still, even in 2015, the mortality rate for measles is about 1 to 2 cases per 1,000, which were a disease which is completely preventable. And in fact, in the United States, over the time period from 2000 to 2011, not a single domestically acquired case of measles occurred. So for something that's completely preventable, which we've shown could be the case with measles, a mortality rate of even 1 in 500 is just completely unacceptable.
Yeah. So actually, I want to rewind just to a point that you were saying about before this outbreak, that the way that Americans were catching measles was actually not in America. Could you just sort of elaborate a little bit on that point?
Yeah, so the measles vaccine was introduced, back in the early 60s, and we saw slowly and steadily declining rates of measles from that point through until the turn of the century. And in 2000, the United States declared that measles was eradicated in the United States. We had sufficient vaccination against the measles, and we just weren't seeing cases in the United States. The only people who really were diagnosed with measles were people who had confirmed travel outside of this country. So it really was a public health, really triumph in terms of eradicating this disease. And we've seen this, in the past with a handful of other problems, smallpox, for example. But then increasing rates of non-vaccinators, for a variety of reasons, had sort of taken root. And what ended up happening over time is patches in the population where vaccine rates were sufficiently low enough allowed measles then to take hold once again. And unfortunately, Orange County in California is one of the areas in the country with the highest rates of non-vaccination. And in fact, if you go to, some of these public school systems in Orange County, you may see non-vaccination rates specifically against the measles as high as, 16%, which is just, completely ridiculous that would be allowed to happen. But laws in this country and in this state have made it easier and easier over the course of the years for families to opt out of doing vaccines. And it's really unfortunate.
Yeah. So, coming back to that, to that 16%, I know that, for some of our viewers, that doesn't sound like a very high number, but, I think that what helps, to help, folks understand about how herd immunity works is that, that's kind of the, the beginning of the crack in the dam, that little number of 10%, 16%, these,
sure.
It might not sound like an impressive number, but it's enough people where you are giving a germ like the measles virus an opportunity, right?
Absolutely. It doesn't take a lot. For a virus that is as easily spread as the measles, that's the thing you got to remember. When 90% of close contacts can contract the measles, you have to have a very, very high rate of protection in order for that virus not to be able to take hold and really spread. So if you've got a disease that has a much lower rate of transmission, you don't have to worry about having these mega high rates of immunity. But with measles, 90% of non-immunized or non-protected individuals in contact will get the disease, and that means you must have very, very high rates And, many the epidemiologists have kind of looked at this, and they said they estimated somewhere between 94 and 96% of the population needs to be immune in order for the vaccine to really do its job and completely, remove measles from the face of the planet.
Right.
So that's really a big part of what had led public health programs to make a transition from a single vaccine, which was introduced in 1963 and continued to be the norm until about 1990. A single vaccine was all that was advised for patients to get immunity, and that was about 95% effective. But in 1990, after looking at the data, the public health folks really determined that we needed to do better. And so they increased the recommendation from a single vaccine to a booster vaccine. And that booster vaccine increases the effectiveness from 95 to 99%. And by doing that, even though we may not reach, the goal of 100% of people vaccinated, we get higher rates of vaccine take within the community. And that is what really, between 1990 and 2000, allowed the United States to declare itself measles free.
Right. And actually, I'm glad that you brought up that point, because I think, for some of our listeners, there may have been some of that confusion, right? Because even for guys like us who grew up in that time period that you're talking about, we got one measles shot, and then, you're
Right.
watching your own kids get two. And I think it really does kind of help understand what the logic and reasoning that, we wanted to go from rates of public immunity from 95% to, like you're saying, 99%. But again, those percentiles, that's applying to the country. You're in Orange County, and it sounds like you guys are at, I don't know, 84, 85%. That's pretty scary, man.
It is scary for sure. I mean, I think, people who are unvaccinated should really be, thinking twice. They need to be reconsidering, and they need to be hopefully, making smarter decisions based on, what the science and what the fact of the matter is really telling us. I mean, the public health department here in Orange County has recently released recommendations, and they've sort of said parents of children who are not vaccinated against the measles, and that includes, infants under age 1, that they should be very cautious about going out into large areas with large
large crowds,
groups of people. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, and just like you were pointing out, at the beginning of this conversation, that's not just Disneyland. That includes malls, movie theaters.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
a lot of
absolutely.
places that people spend a lot of time in.
Absolutely, and I think if this really lights a fire under the non-vaccination movement to really reconsider and think twice, and really look at the data again with a more objective eye instead of the eyes of fear. I mean, I think we need to put this thing into perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in Orange County in 2015, the total number of cases of measles that's affected Orange County residents is 25. I mean, that's not a huge number, all right? Population 3 million in Orange County.
Right.
I mean, while we talk about 80 cases linked to the Disneyland outbreak, a lot of those are travelers or people from other states or other parts of California. And so it's a big deal. I mean, these are numbers which are not trivial,
right,
considering we had, more than a decade of zero.
Yeah, right.
In 2014, the United States, I think 640 was the total number of documented cases of measles. So, I mean, this is still a small number. I don't think people should be afraid of the measles, especially if you're vaccinated against it. We need to put it into perspective. These are still relatively small numbers, but they're the canary in the mine. They're really sending us this message that we need to be more careful. We can't be as tolerant of lackadaisical approaches when it comes to vaccinations. Vaccinations, are the single most valuable development at saving lives. From a public health standpoint, they are far and away the most valuable thing. I think most experts agree that we do. And, it needs to be something that we take seriously.
Right.
As an individual, you want to make sure that you can protect yourself, your family. The science supports the safety of vaccines without a doubt. And I think the other thing that's interesting is we really need to take a look at vaccination against these highly communicable diseases as really a part of your social responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not just about protecting, your loved ones. It's about participating in the community and doing your part to protect everyone else, because that is really what herd immunity is about.
Right.
We know that not everybody can be vaccinated.
Right.
Something, if you have certain conditions or immune compromised, the vaccine may not be appropriate, or you may not be able to take hold of it. If you're under age 1, the vaccine does not work very well for you.
Right.
And so,
right. And and we have examples of this, right? You and I have, taken care of, kids where they've got like peanut allergies, and now we're seeing more schools where like they won't even serve peanut butter in the cafeteria because they're trying to, protect these few children with the peanut allergy, even though the majority of the kids don't have that. And and these are the things that we do for each other as a society, that we don't let the few vulnerable just fight off the wolves by themselves. And I think that I'm glad that you're bringing up this point about the social responsibility, because I heard in California that Governor Brown has tried to make opting out of vaccines a little bit more difficult for the parents who are trying to send their kids to school. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. Many states in the country actually have vaccine exemption laws where, as a parent, if you decline to get your child vaccinated based on religious or philosophical grounds, you can essentially not have your child vaccinated and still attend public schools. There are some states that don't allow for that. It's like you have to get your kid vaccinated and there's no way around it. But historically, over the past 20 years or so, California had made it gradually easier and easier for families, without really providing very solid grounds, to not give the vaccine, not to give any vaccines, in fact. This past year, Governor Jerry Brown signed into legislation a clause that essentially made it harder. And what is required now is any family who attends a public school system who does not want their child to be vaccinated against any of the required vaccines, they must consult with their physician, and a physician actually has to sign off on a special form that says we've counseled the family on the risks to your child and to the risks of the community of not vaccinating. And part of many pediatricians have actually taken the stance and said, you know what, I'm not going to sign this form. And we're seeing more and more pediatric practices, I think, taking a little bit more aggressive responsibility for this problem and trying to really reverse it by saying, we're not gonna see families who don't vaccinate. It's part of our social responsibility. It's part of what we as physicians feel is in the best interest of all children, all people. Mm-hmm. And if you're not going to participate in that social, health policy, then you're just going to have to find a different medical home. And, I think to some degree, as pediatricians, perhaps, we've contributed to this measles problem. The family-centered health model that's taken hold over the course of the past couple of decades, where we really try to incorporate the families into medical-making decisions more and more. Mm-hmm. Gone are the days where people just blindly follow their doctor's recommendation. Right. We really are trying to bring the family and make them understand what's happening. It's about making that decision together. And when too many families are, not wanting to do vaccines, we, as a pediatrician, we want to still be there to support them, and we want to help them kind of navigate through that decision. And all too often, I think we allow that to happen. Even though we've done our best to convince them, we allow them to make those decisions. Even though we feel in our hearts, we know the medical science says it's bad decision-making. And we've tolerated it. We've been accommodating to families. But I think what you'll find over the coming years is a growing intolerance at the physician level for those families who choose, to clearly avoid the medical evidence, to really deny the fact that vaccines are effective and vaccines are safe.
Right.
A big part of this is fear. It's fear that was in large part brought about around the dawn of the internet era and
right.
Really propagated by autism. I mean, autism rates are climbing and climbing for a variety of reasons, but people fear this association between vaccines and autism. And it's been debunked. It's been proven time and time again. That's not happening. It really isn't. And the message is getting out there. I mean, they're hearing it, but they're slow sometimes to really accept that, because fear can be a very powerful driving motivator. And I think the best thing that we can do as physicians is really, state the facts, be clear, be concise, be, steadfast in our dedication that this is the way to go. And, I think as parents more and more, in their interactions with the community and with friends and family, hear that message time and time again, resonated by everyone, the message will finally get home.
Yeah.
Hopefully, the few physician detractors who really, are the minority of physicians out there who don't recommend the standard vaccine protocol, they'll have less and less of a voice, and people will hear more and more what the reality for the facts about vaccine are.
Right. Well, Dr. Jonathan Ott, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I really appreciate your perspectives and reminding us that, vaccines are not just good for our own individual health, they're good for our society's health, our family's health, and that they really are a part of our social responsibility. And I think you're absolutely right. This message is starting to resonate with people. And, I really appreciate your hard work, and, give Melissa and the kids my best. And hopefully we'll have you again on the show real soon.
I'd be real happy with that. It's real nice to talk with you today.
All right. Thanks a lot, man. We'll
take care now.
Okay. And when we come back, I've got a special message for the anti-vaxxers. You've been listening to Dr. America. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, on the We Act Radio Network, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Hi, welcome back to the Dr. America Show. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. And in today's show, we've been talking a little bit about measles, and I had just one more thing I really needed to get off my chest towards these anti-vaxxers before we move on to the next segment of the show. And, a fact that has really pissed me off about this particular outbreak of measles in Southern California is that 6 babies have caught the measles in this outbreak. What they all have in common? They're all younger than 1, which is the age at which we give the first dose of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. So they were too young to get vaccinated. But these babies' vaccines were otherwise up to date. That means that their parents were taking the responsible steps in protecting their children's health. So what that means is that these 6 babies caught the measles not out of a failure of pediatrics, not out of a failure of, their parents. It was because it was a failure of these anti-vaxxer families for not recognizing what Dr. Oth just pointed out in our last segment, their social responsibility to the rest of us. These babies were counting on us. They were counting on the rest of their herd to keep up immunity so that when diseases like measles come along, the rest of us, through our immunity, are protecting them until they're old enough to get the vaccine and then they can live their lives. These babies are not alone. There are lots and lots of patients who are too sick or too immune disabled to get the vaccine for measles. Examples? Leukemia patients. Those kids that that break our hearts when we see them on TV or right before the movie previews come on. Those kids who are struggling to fight cancer. Their immune systems are not able to handle the vaccine and build immunity themselves. So they're counting on the rest of us to give them this immunity so that they can have a shot at fighting the disease of cancer, leukemia, you name it. But they need us. They need their fellow Americans to protect them. This is part of our social responsibility. And it just angers me that we, would fail our fellow Americans in such a basic way when it comes to taking these vaccines, that we know that they work. To the anti-vaxxers out there, to me, you're as dangerous as drunk drivers, and you're probably as stupid as those people who keep demanding President Obama's birth certificate or keep denying that there's anything like climate change going on. At least with the drunk drivers, I can say this. I at least can wrap my compassion around addiction science. I can understand that there's something there, scientifically, neuroscientifically, sociologically, that we need to get our minds around, our hearts around, so that we can help patients with substance abuse issues. Yes, it pisses me off when they make a bad decision that threatens the lives of the rest of us. But at least with people with substance abuse issues, I can wrap some compassion around them to try and help them so that we can prevent those bad decisions from happening in the future. The anti-vaxxers, I don't know what your excuse is, because please don't call yourselves skeptics. If anything, you are not skeptical, you are cynical, and there's a big difference. I love skeptics. Skeptics are the kinds of people who at the very basic have curiosity. They have questions about our proof, our science. They want to learn more. They want to understand it better, rather than just giving us blind trust, which is fine by me. Don't trust medicine blindly. Ask questions, engage in conversations, learn more. Help us learn from you. And we can overcome your skepticism and make the right decision. And that's the thing about skeptics that I find always interesting, is that once you have the right conversations, once you've laid out the proof and you've shown some transparency, a good number of genuine skeptics are going to actually say, you know what? I see where you're coming from. Your argument has persuaded me, and let's take some responsible course of action. When it comes to the anti-vaxxers, you're cynics. It's nothing but ignorance and arrogance. Time and again, I hear them being interviewed on TV, on the radio, on the internet, and there's no amount of trust building that we can do to help them do the right thing in getting all of us protected against things like the measles. And you know what? Science doesn't owe you, anti-vaxxers, any more than what we've already done. We have spent millions of dollars disproving that there is any kind of relationship between vaccines and autism. In fact, those are millions of dollars that could have gone towards autism research. Those are millions of dollars that could have gone towards researching the real toxins that are out there. And and I'm just honestly really tired of having to prove these same points again and again and again. It's time for these anti-vaxxers to step up, do your socially responsible part, recognize that as Americans, we have to count on each other if we're ever going to really see things like measles be completely eradicated again, if we're ever really going to see things like whooping cough disappear. We owe this to each other. This is how herd immunity works. It is part of that web of mutuality that, it connects us in all the other things that we talk about on this show, whether it's, expansion of Obamacare, whether it's, getting people the reproductive health care that they need. These are all things that are tied together in the web of mutuality that make us healthier together. Vaccines are the most basic part of that. And I implore my anti-vaxxers out there, I implore my friends who are friends of anti-vaxxers to please, drag them kicking and screaming back into the light. We really can't afford to have any more babies, any more patients with cancer be put at risk for something as basic as measles because we have like too much, arrogance and ignorance out there. I really am counting on you guys as my fellow Americans to do your part. I really, really appreciate, people like Dr. Jonathan Oth having these conversations with their patients. I know lots of my colleagues are doing the exact same. We love talking about the safety of vaccines. We are more than here to answer all your questions and to have these conversations. But at the end of the day, please know that there are consequences to your decision that go beyond your immediate family, and that we owe this to each other as fellow Americans. All right. So I just had to get that off my chest. We're going to keep this program rolling. The next topic that I want to talk about is concussions, because this episode is airing on Super Bowl Sunday. And, besides the whole Deflategate scandal going on with the Patriots and the NFL and all of that, concussions have been a really important controversial issue. And, there's still a lot that we're learning, but so far the scientific evidence is very concerning for the consequences of CTE, that is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It causes emotional problems, damage to decision-making abilities, and, lots and lots of other consequences that our athletes are suffering through. And it's not just the NFL. We're seeing this in, the National Hockey League. We're seeing this in the NCAA, and even in, the WWE, the wrestlers. All of them are, starting to pay more and more attention to concussions. And, there's still a lot of information that we need to learn about. There's still a lot of questions to be asked. And, I'm really hoping that advocates and journalists will keep up their efforts to get to the bottom of the truth. But for this segment of the program, what I'd like to do is help athletes and parents of athletes, get with some news that they can use. And, how do we know if an athlete in our lives has a concussion? What can we do about it? And how can we advocate in our communities for safer sports? So to help us answer some of these questions, we have Dr. Moin Sala, who is going to be joining us. He is a board-certified physician specializing in sports medicine in Southern California. And since graduating from medical school and training in the field of sports medicine, Dr. Sala has been the head team physician for the USA Olympic BMX men and women teams. He has also been the head team physician for Mountain Dew Action's sports tour, the powerhouse of Gardena Sierra High School football, and he is a veteran on-course physician for the Hawaii Ironman World Championships. During his training at UCLA and other surrounding facilities, Dr. Sala focused his attention on the growing epidemic of head injuries, including concussions. So, Dr. Sala, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Sanjeev, thank you so much for having me on the show. The timing of our chat on concussions is fairly fortuitous, especially since it is Super Bowl week. And while the topic of concussions has been more in the spotlight recently over the past few years, it hasn't always been that way. So just to take you back, just a decade ago, head injuries were an afterthought. Back then and even before then, when an athlete would have a head injury, they were just thought to have had their bell rung or their, quote, cobwebs knocked loose.
Right, and that was considered kind of a coming of age, and, that was sort of a kind of way of getting hair on your chest as an athlete, right?
Exactly. The thinking was that, real athletes push through these injuries to show their true grit, that these head injuries would build you up and make you outlast further punishment. It got, so crazy that some people, that was actually like 40% of Americans 10 years ago thought that, another hit to the head while you're having an active concussion or head injury would actually help you recover faster from the first hit, like Wile E. Coyote cartoon.
Oh, wow. So, but it sounds like we're learning a lot more about concussions, and I know that some of our listeners are athletes and some of them are the parents of athletes at different ages. So, when should we suspect a concussion has happened in an adult versus a child? And, not to make things more complicated, because I understand there are different levels of concussions, but how do we identify what level we're looking at when we are, trying to protect the athletes in our lives?
Those are great questions. I think the first thing we got to figure out and understand is what is a concussion.
Mm-hmm.
So scientifically, they're head injuries that can be from direct or indirect contact to the head. It basically causes the brain to shake violently, bouncing around inside the skull. Essentially, it bruises the brain. The technical term that it's known as is mild traumatic brain injuries. So concussion is a mild traumatic brain injury. When you hear that term, that scientific term, hopefully it sheds a little more light on the seriousness of the injuries. That jarring effect on the brain interrupts and impairs a lot of the normal brain functions. So athletes typically will have, changes in their thinking, their equilibrium and balance, even their consciousness. So, it's not just thinking about just athletes as well. Sometimes it can happen to anyone. If you're in a car accident, if you fall and hit your head, and sometimes it's not just football as well. Everyone talks about football being the kind of the only place where concussions can come from, but women's soccer is notoriously high. Wrestling, kind of like how you mentioned the other sports as well. So, now that we've kind of defined what a concussion is, typically when a concussion happens, most athletes have headaches, nausea, fogginess, kind of dizziness. They may feel like they're a little sensitive to light and sound. They usually don't feel themselves. It's tough to concentrate. They sometimes feel depressed. Those are tough things to see because they're not, they're very subjective.
Mm-hmm.
If the athlete lost consciousness, that pretty much guarantees a concussion. But the majority of the time, they don't lose consciousness. So when do we suspect the concussion, just like between adults and children? Well, as a team doc, my focus is usually looking at the athlete's body when I'm on the sideline. So I'm always focusing on their body and especially their head. Did they get helmet-to-helmet contact in football? Did their head snap back? Did they get an elbow to the head while going for a ball in soccer? Or were they snowboarding and did they fall and catch an edge and have their body and head recoil off the ground? That kind of gives me my initial information. Hey, I need to look out for this athlete. I need to check them out on the sidelines. The symptoms between the adults and children are similar, but it's tougher to get a diagnosis, especially with children. First, you're dealing with a historian and a kid that may not understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
They're maybe afraid to let their trainer, coach know that they have something going on, and maybe their thought process is that they got to push through it, and that's what will make them a tough athlete, and that's what their parents did, so that's what they need to do. So it really takes a team approach, especially with children. You're focusing on talking with the trainer, talking with the coach, talking with the parents. The parents know the child better than anyone. Are they acting normally? Do they seem like they're having trouble focusing? On the sideline and in the clinic, what we do is we try to evaluate both the adults and children with certain tests. First, we kind of check their state neurologically. So, I'll use my pen light and shine it in their eyes and see how their pupils react. I'll check a couple other nerves in their face and make sure they're working appropriately. I'll make sure they don't have neck pain because a big problem with head injuries is we make sure the neck's okay. And then we can actually use, a couple questions to kind of check to see kind of how their brain is functioning. We can check their knowledge by asking them their name, where they are, what happened on the play in question, who the president of the United States is, simple knowledge that everyone should know.
Mm-hmm.
We try to test their memory, so I give them a few things to remember, and I'll ask them later, what were the 3 words I told you? And then I ask them about simple math things, like, hey, count backwards from 100 by 5s, or can you spell the word world?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if they're struggling in these, things, it continues to up my suspicion. Is this a true concussion? And again, the trainer, the coach, especially the parent will know, hey, my kid's not acting right. They normally know this stuff. As concussions have kind of come into the mainstream, the big deal that we're noticing is that we're really focusing on concussions in children because they are more serious. Just as you said, their brains are still developing. They take longer to recover because of that. And then there's the worry about cumulative head injuries and their impact as you get older.
Right.
So,
And so that actually kind of like leads me to like kind of the next question about, so, how would we, because, we want to make sure that, we're not putting kids, and other athletes at risk for the next concussion or a new, traumatic brain injury by putting them back into sports too soon. So how do we know when it's safe to go back to playing a sport? And, what happens if you do get sent back into play too soon?
When we think about concussions, the treatment is universal. It's brain rest. And it kind of sounds easy. Hey, you need to rest your brain. But it's really tougher than it sounds like. It means limiting or avoiding, if that's possible, all television, computers, smartphones, podcasts, video games, music, even homework while your brain heals. And it also means avoiding exercise. All of these things I mentioned activate the brain and delay healing. And, I try to relate to my athletes, especially the kids. Your brain is bruised. It's like your knee being bruised. If you smash your knee against something and it's hurting and you try to run and exercise, do you think it's going to take longer for your knee to heal?
Mm-hmm.
And they realize and they nod. And I said, that's the same thing happening with your brain. You really need to give it the time to let it heal on its own. So, what I do is we make sure that we closely monitor the athletes, that they're improving slowly, that, along with the brain rest, they're not having any worsening of symptoms. And some of the things we look out for are they vomiting? Has their mental status changed? Have they had a seizure? Those are very worrisome symptoms. Maybe they need some head imaging at that point. But typically most people don't have those type of symptoms. So once they're fully asymptomatic, so they got no headache left, they've been great for at least 3 or more consecutive days, I usually advocate doing a stress test on them. A stress test is as simple as having them jog in place and doing jumping jacks and push-ups and sit-ups, or riding a stationary bike. What I'm trying to do is increase their heart rate, try to kind of stress the brain, and see if they redevelop any of those concussion symptoms again. If they do fine, don't have any symptoms with that simple 10, 15-minute test, then I usually clear them to get back to their sport, but it's on a gradual return to play. So now that they've been asymptomatic, they pass my little stress test, I say, okay, you can clear. You're cleared for practice, but the first thing is I'm only going to put you in non-contact, and I'm only going to let you do drills initially. So the trainer's going to keep a closer eye on them. They're going to see how they do that first day. If they have no symptoms, they'll maybe get it back into some scrimmaging, but no contact. And then if they do well with that, I'll get them back to contact practice. And then the last step is I'll clear them for play. But if at any point along that little pathway they feel symptoms again, they go back to the start. You do not pass go. You do not collect 200. The second thing that you asked about is what happens if you haven't fully healed from your first concussion and you potentially get hit again.
Mm-hmm.
So that's extremely worrisome. There's a syndrome out there. It's called second impact syndrome. And when the brain hasn't fully healed from the first injury or the first concussion, it's extremely susceptible to an even far worse injury with even a little, less stimuli. So just a little bump to the head when you have a concussion could cause a worse concussion or this second impact syndrome. That is caused from severe brain swelling, and when the brain swells like that, it's usually fatal. Kids who do survive usually have significant delays, and I've actually sadly seen this firsthand. I did a rotation at a pediatric emergency room during residency, and I had a previously healthy 10-year-old who came into the ER with seizures, and I spoke with the mom. Kid was totally normal, was playing Pop Warner football, had a head injury, turns out to be a concussion, didn't tell anyone, didn't really know, went back in, played the next week, had another head injury, immediately started having seizures, has suffered from daily seizures since, and then suffers from mental retardation. So I've seen it firsthand, and it's scary. But now at least things are more out in the public, and people are getting educated about it.
Yeah, so and that actually leads into like kind of the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, is that like what can families do to keep their young athletes safe, and are there ages that are like just too young for certain sports? I mean, because you're a dad, and what's your approach? Knowing what you know and seeing what you've seen.
Yeah, those are good questions as well. The most important thing I tell my parents to consider, my athletes to consider, are you ready for that sport? Is your child ready for that sport? Do you feel like they can, like for football, can they learn those proper tackling techniques and not lead with their head when they try to tackle? Do they have that body control? Most people would say it doesn't make sense for anyone who's not up into high school, so 13 and younger, to try tackle football. But Pop Warner's there. Does it make sense for them to be exposed so early to potentially violent sport? It's interesting now, like Pop Warner football participation has dropped off significantly. So just in the past 5 years, it's dropped 30%. Most parents don't want to expose their kids to these repetitive head hits. Mm-hmm. And they've seen that, you don't necessarily need to put your kid in one sport all year round to make them good and potentially better for the future, get them that college scholarship, multiple sports, build them up. I was reading that, in Pop Warner, they estimate the head impacts during each season at about 200 to 500 hits or head impacts throughout the season. Wow. And these kids start when they're 6, 7, 8 years old, play up till high school, and then play into high school. Even LeBron James in the last few weeks, people asked him, he has 2 sons like I do. Mm-hmm. And they said, what would you let your kids play? And he's like, basketball, baseball, I'll let them swim and run track. What about football? No, I won't let them play because of concussions, because of the aftermath. Huh. So I have 2 sons, 5 years old and 3 years old. We do watch a lot of football, but I also realize that, that I'm very fortunate to say that, my sons won't ever play Pop Warner. They won't play tackle football. If they want to play flag football or two-hand catch, I'm probably fine with that. And I'll wholeheartedly support any of their other athletic pursuits. But having seen so many injuries close up, it's not worth it. So really, it comes down to a few things. Do you think your child's ready for that sport? Physically, mentally? Can they learn those right tackling techniques, especially in football? Does it make sense for, athletes in soccer to head the ball? As a young athlete in soccer through AYSO, into high school, college, club, the repetitive head hits add up. Does that lead to that chronic traumatic encephalopathy? Right. So these are all things that we have to, be concerned about, aware about, and hopefully we can make informed decisions.
I really appreciate this candor, and also just because you're able to speak from both being a parent and a physician. I've got one last question for you, and it's not an easy one because we don't really have too much time left. But I did want to kind of get your take on this because it does involve, I think, some parents actually kind of trying to make some policy happen on their, at their local government level. So last week, the New York City Council started going over some legislation that would require a doctor or an athletic trainer to be present at all organized youth football games for all full contact practices. And they are also, the legislation has in it a task force. They're going to build a task force to collect data on all concussions to, guide future safety recommendations. Advocates are saying that this is the first proposed legislation of its kind, and the trainer for the Pittsburgh Steelers actually testified to the New York City Council that he thought it was important to pass this law. But others are pointing out that the cost of having a doctor on the field is going to make it really tough to fund youth sports in poor communities. So it sounds like the City Council is kind of stuck between safety and cost. What do you think, Dr. Sala?
It raises an interesting dilemma. As a sports medicine physician and as just a sports fan in general, when I'm on the sidelines of, my high school team that I cover, I'm a volunteer physician. When I trained through one of the UCLA sports medicine programs, I was blessed to be a part of this program here in Los Angeles. It was called the West Coast Sports Medicine Foundation, and they had a Team to Win program. And what they did for 22 local high schools, they would provide athletic trainers, physicians who would volunteer their time on the sidelines and in a Saturday injury clinic to, provide coverage and educate athletes and diagnose and treat them. So I was exposed to a lot of young athletes, and the cost was practically nil. So I think, does it make sense to have physician, medical, athletic trainer coverage on the sidelines of any youth football game or any football game? I wholeheartedly agree so. I think the cost would be minimal because most physicians would want to be out there. If you're a sports medicine physician, most of us love sports. We especially love kids playing sports. We want to look after them and keep a close eye on them and make sure that, we can try to prevent future problems from happening. Again, some of the things that we need to look at are, does it make sense for kids, younger than 12 or 13 to be tackling, to lead with their head, to have so many repetitive head impacts? And it's tough to change that kind of sports center mentality that our society has, where all the biggest hits are glamorized and, the routine hits aren't. So, I think it's something that if we give it time, it'll kind of tease itself out further. This is another big step for us. And hopefully, just as there's more awareness and education, people can make better informed decisions. But I would definitely support having physicians, athletic trainers on the sidelines of all football games and see how they do.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Saleh, thank you so much for joining us. I know that we ran out of time a little bit today, and we're definitely going to have you back to guide our families, because I think that you gave us a lot of food for thought. Really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys, and thank you so much, Sanjeev.
All right. Well, everybody, this is it for Dr. America this week. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope this episode has given you guys some food for thought to protect your families against things like measles and concussions, totally preventable, causes of injury and misery among our fellow Americans. Let's do better. We can do better. We owe this to each other. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. And until next time, salud to your health.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Hello, my name is Jim Gray, and I am a judge of the Superior Court in California and a former federal prosecutor in Los Angeles. I would like to talk to you for a moment about marijuana. Did you know that since the federal government first banned marijuana in 1937, usage in this country has actually gone up by about 4,000%? Or did you know that in the Netherlands, where adults are allowed to possess small amounts of marijuana and buy it from government-regulated businesses, fewer adults and fewer teenagers smoke marijuana than here in our country? Or that an American is arrested on marijuana charges every 38 seconds? If you are wondering if any of this makes sense, you are not alone. To find out more, contact the Marijuana Policy Project at 1-877-JOIN-MPP or visit them on the web at mpp.org. Thank you, and good luck to us all.